doesn't really have much. He is quite capped. And then when you select the bet size, what are you representing? You would use a small bet size, which represents more of a medium pair, right? But also, you don't really get fear getting raised too much, and your range is protected. And you know that villain doesn't really have very much, right? Villain doesn't really have much because, one, he probably is not unpredictable enough, but two, there's just not a whole lot of hands to have. He couldn't have had 8-6. He couldn't have had 6-4. So unless he checks back like top set of nines, he doesn't have a whole lot, right? And that means that we use for the bigger bet size. 3 bet sizes: small, large, huge, right? Small bet mostly happens when you've got a lot of just average or like decent value hands, so you're trying to get a bit of value. Bigger bets, obviously, when both ranges are a bit more polarized, right? And big betting, like huge betting as an over betting, mostly happens when your range is very, very strong and his range is quite capped. So if, let's say, you've got a lot of good hands, but he does too, it makes sense to bet big, right? If you have a lot of decent hands, your opponent has decent hands, makes sense to go small. If you have a lot of good hands, but your opponent doesn't, then you want to go really large. And when you've got that big advantage in terms of EV and equity and whatnot, it's very important to bet as large as you possibly can, getting value with the top end of your range for the maximum amount. That's very important. It's a mistake you often see at lower stakes, people not being willing to get enough value. It's a very, very common mistake. And as you see, every time we go back to these hands, we end up with the same fundamental principles, right? And the first question is always this one. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. What are you representing? What are you representing? And what does your opponent have, right? If you say decent versus decent, small bet. Strong versus strong, big bet. Strong versus weak, then you go for the massive bet, right? That's the easiest way I can explain it to you. You don't like to polarize on the flop or just the sizing. Would you go half pot? That's a story for another day, Andre. There's a million strategies you can use. There's literally a million strategies. So Lee says, I get lost in these spots. Like on the river, what is hero's best bluff again? And what are villain's best bluff catchers? It's a great question, Lee. So when it comes to your bluffs, what is your goal with a bluff? You're trying to get your opponent to fold a better hand than yours. Okay, so what do you want to do? You want to look at which hands is my opponent going to call with, right? And you want to block them. So if, let's say, villain is going to call with a pair of tens, let's say the only hand he can ever call with is a pair of tens, well, then you'd want to have a 10 in your hand, right? If, let's say, you want to block your opponent's flushes, well, we know that the ace blocker obviously works great. So you want to unblock your own air hands, Lee. That's number one. You want to unblock your opponent's folding range, and you want to block his calling range. Generally, Lee, if you are representing the nuts, you obviously want to bet very large, right? So you'd probably want to have some blockers to the nuts. If you have very poor blockers to the nuts, you generally want to select a smaller bet size. So, but always think like, what is my opponent potentially going to call me with? And do I block those calling hands? If you do a very poor job of blocking them, you generally want to either give up or you want to select a smaller sizing to make him fold some other type of weak hands. But you're not going to make him fold the hands you're targeting mostly, right? But it's a great question. So once more, guys, block your opponent's calling range, block your opponent's calling range. You want to unblock your opponent's folding range, and you want to block your own good hands. That's number 3. So let's say we've got an ace-high flush draw that missed. Do you block your opponent's calling hands? No, right? I mean, if the flush got there, sure, but you don't. If you have an ace-high flush draw and you just have ace-high, you don't block any pairs on the river. You don't block any straights usually. So you don't block any good hands for him. Do you block your opponent's folding range? You don't want to, but you do, right? I mean, let's say in a 3-bet pot, a lot of people call the flush draw twice and then fold. So you block your opponent's folding range, right? And then do you block your own value bets? No, you don't. So you see, okay, generally ace-high flush draws are not great hands for triple barreling, assuming that everything misses, right? And then I'm sure you guys have seen that in Pi before, that ace-high flush draws are usually give-ups. I mean, virtually always give-ups. Now, if you have some type of hand that doesn't block flush draws, but does block the straight, that is the nuts or whatnot, or the set that's the nuts or whatever, that would be a much better hand to bluff with. So again, one more time, because it's so important. You want to block your opponent's calling range, number one. You want to unblock your opponent's folding range, number two. And you want to block your own value bets, that's number three. Very, very important stuff. You cannot forget that. So when I say don't forget it, it means write it down or listen to the session again, right, in a few days from now, whenever it's released, and make sure you don't forget. And the best way to not forget, guys, is by making notes, right? I mean, there's a couple of things I said that I find by far most important here, and you can never forget them, right? So I want you to write it down. Just write down, like, I mean, get a word page, title it in capital letters. Do not forget this about poker, and write it down. And then let's say once a week you just read it. I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot that one. Good one, right? It's as simple as that. Andre says, I don't always check over pairs that are on the flop, but I maybe overreacted how that card hit both our ranges. Do you never check aces or kings there? Aces more often than kings for sure, Andre. I mean, so you have to think in that hand. Let's go to it. No. Where is it? Come on. Oh, sorry. It was actually the one you sent. So, actually, we won't go to it, I guess. So, I mean, if you look at that turn, right, it was 7-5-3. Okay, so not a good board for us, but not a terrible one. But then on the 9, like, you have to think, like, what improves? 8-6 suited, most people don't call that. 9-7 suited, people don't call that. 9s, yes, definitely. So basically, we're now hopelessly behind against 3 combinations of hands, right? Which is not a disaster. Let's say the flush gets there. Maybe you're behind hopelessly against like 10 hands, right? Or let's say like the straight gets there, and maybe you're ahead against behind against 8 hands or 10 hands. So you have to think not only like, is it a good card, but like how often does it actually hurt me? How do you select nutted hands into block bets to be protected? So you want to pick generally when nutted hands that block the calling range, Amar. So let's say in a spot like, I'll show you. So in this spot, Amar, let's talk about the turn check back range. Forget about pre-flop. Forget about what's realistic. Imagine this is button big blind, okay? So queen 3-4, we see bet full range, let's say, and the turn is an 8, double flush, okay? We want to play, let's say, 150% pots sizing or check. Okay, fine, right? Maybe you go a bit bigger, maybe a bit smaller, whatever. So on this turn, you'd want to check back in like pocket queens a decent amount of the time. An 8 is hard to hit, a 3 and a 4 are also hard to hit. So when you have 2 queens in your hand, it's very, very difficult for villain to continue with anything, right? So with pocket queens, you'd want to check back sometimes. Now, if you've got like pocket 3s, 4s, and 8s, not so much, right? Because now we unblock villain's calling range. Because the calling range against an overbet is going to be a very strong draw or a queen, but mostly a queen, right? So if you have a nutted hand, which blocks a lot of villains' continuing hands, like a lot of the ways you're going to make this pot very large, slow playing often makes sense. If you don't block any of them, it doesn't make sense. So for instance here, so on queen 3, 4, 8, 3s and 4s are always fast played. Pocket 8 is obviously better than 3s and 4s, which is great. But then again, you do block in like queen 8, which villain is going to call down 3 streets with most likely. Okay, so disguised nutted hands like 3s get fast played a lot. Hands that are nutted but block calls don't get fast played so much. So another example would be here, right? So pocket queens here wouldn't really be bet much because, again, you block a lot of your opponent's calling range. And if villain has an 8, he's going to put the money in anyway, right? There's no real, let's say he has pocket 3s that he called on the flop. He's going to put the money in anyway, so it doesn't really matter what you do, right? You can take any line and you're going to get a stack regardless. But let's say a hand like pocket kings is a nutted hand as well, but that hand blocks a lot fewer calls, right? So that with pocket kings, you'd want to fast play more often. Let's say you've got an 8 here. Let's say you 3-bet 8-7 suited. You'd want to fast play more because now, okay, it's still unlikely you get called by an 8, But at least, I mean, villain will have queen 10, queen jack, king queen, ace queen, right? So now you unblock the calling range. So 8-7 here is kind of similar to like pocket fours or threes in the previous example, whereas pocket queens is still pocket queens, right? So think about like, how do you block hands? How do you make, like, how do you block hands that can make the pot large, right? That call and make the pot large. Maldwin says, given hero says villain is very bad, would an overbet on the turn be viable exploitatively? Which hand would that be, Maldwin? Was that in the hand that was linked? Well, it depends. Okay, so it's a good question, but it depends bad in what way. You know, bad as in, is he way too nitty? Okay, making you want to be not so tricky, right? Nitty and like, is he bad as in he's crazy aggressive? Okay, that makes you want to check raise. I mean, it depends on what way he's in, which way he's bad. He makes insane check raises. Okay, so if you say, okay, insane check raise, if you say he's very aggressive, then yeah, check raising all in might make sense, right? Because he will just bet the turn with something ridiculous. Or you'll make thinner value bets because he'll make ridiculous calls. You have to basically find a way for him to spaz out. Advise hide result. Yeah, we can do that next time. The flop and the turn play is a topic for another day, David. As for, when it comes to that pocket fours call, yeah, villain must. So when it comes to that call, it's actually not as bad as it looks. I mean, is this a good call? I don't think it is. Is this a terrible play? I don't think it's terrible. So if we go back to the hand here, so with pocket fours, like yeah, you have a pair, okay, so it's possible to win. So, but the thing is, this hand is not as bad as it looks. What are our bluffs going to be? You know, Jack 10, Queen Jack, King Queen, all these overcards. So when you've got pocket fours, you know, you could argue that a hand like, let's say we only shove like Queens plus, you could argue that like a hand like, I mean, let's say Jacks plus whatever, you could argue that a hand like Jacks or like tens is worse to call with than fours, right? If we're bluff catching anyway. So with fours, yeah, you don't have a very strong hand. You don't block the nuts, but at least you do a great job of unblocking your opponent's bluffs, right? A lot of, you know, as I said, Jack 10 type of hands, Jack 10, Queen Jack, King 10, King Jack, King Queen, that type of stuff. So do I believe that the average NL 100 player does that enough? No, but I do think that it's not the worst play ever. So yeah. So, but again, that's bluff catching. If you're interested in that, there's a video in the lab about bluff catching rivers, right? Where I talk about that in greater detail. In fact, for like 2 hours. No worries, Andre. I appreciate you sending a hand. Just make sure that for the next session, you know, just send them some so we can actually incorporate them into the PowerPoint. I mean, in the end, I know you guys don't care about, you know, where you see it as long as you learn, right? But obviously, it just looks more nice, just looks more pretty and professional when we can all put it in the PowerPoint. Would you block river of queens after checking turn? Yeah, so that's a great play, Joe. That's a great play because again, villain is going to have a lot of like middle pairs, Joe, that he might call with, but he's not going to bet with them, right? At the same time, yeah, so I think betting small makes sense. So you ensure a call from like hand like jacks, whatnot. And then if he raises you like you did, you can actually 3-bet and this guy's like, what the hell? And next time you're in this spot and you value bet pocket tens, this guy doesn't take a hand like king queen suited and value raise thinly, right? So next time, so it's also an investment into the future. If he's afraid of you 3-bet shoving all in, then obviously he's not as likely to make thin value raises or even make bluff raises, right? So that helps you in the future because, I mean, when you lead small in the river, most of your hands don't want to see a raise, right? So if you can kind of ensure fewer raises in the future, that's good for you. All right, my old one, thank you for joining. We have time for more questions. We've got like 5 to 10 more minutes. Can you repeat the strong versus strong, decent? Okay, so when it comes to bet check betting, when it comes to bet check betting, if let's say both of you have a decent hand, let's say right here, right? I mean, pocket tens, pocket jacks, that type of stuff. A lot of decent hands. When both of you have a lot of decent hands, you want to mostly go for small bets. Because like your one pair is trying to get value from his worst one pair, let's say. If both of you have strong ranges, but not like exceptionally strong, it makes more sense to go for a big bet. Okay. Obviously with a more polarized and therefore tighter range. If let's say you've got a very, very strong range and he doesn't have a strong range, as in like he's got a bunch of decent hands, so it's very strong versus decent, then you want to find a lot of really big bets, right? Because obviously you're going to be head quite often. So again, if it's button big blind and it's a queen jack 10 run out with no flush getting there, one way or another, you have the gigantic straight advantage and you want to put in a lot of money. And yeah, you can do it on the flop, turn, river, bet, check, bet, no matter how it happens. You have to find gigantic bets. Can you make some other example as to block villain's calling range, unblocking villain's folding range, and block our own value range? Sure. I'm not sure this is the greatest spot. I mean, yeah. Okay. So, I mean, David, the issue here, right, is that a lot of them are not perfect. So, okay, blocking villain's calling range. Let's say we bet third pot on this river, right? What is villain going to call with? Jacks, tens, nines, sevens, maybe ace king high, right? That type of stuff. So if let's say you have jack 10 in your hand, you know, or 10-9, yeah, you do a good job of blocking hands like tens and jacks that are not really folding, right? But so that's great. Perfect. So, but then we go to point number 2, unblocking villain's folding range. Well, that we don't do as well because, I mean, yeah, we block tens that is going to call if we have jack 10, but now we also block his jack 10, right, which is just going to fold in case he didn't bet the turn, right? So we win in option number 1, but we lose option number 2. And then when it comes to blocking our own value range, okay, now we win again because, you know, we're trying to rep jacks and tens as well. So, you know, jack 10 here kind of has 2 out of 3 of the components. But now let's see we pick, I mean, on this run out, let's say we pick like 5 deuce suited. Yes, obviously ridiculous hand example. We'd never 3-bet that hand, but let's pick that hand. Okay, let's say we've got 5. So block villain's calling range with a 5 and a deuce in our hands? Not at all, right? No. Do we unblock villain's folding range? A little bit. You know, we unblock like jack 10, 10-9. Maybe a villain floated the flop with like king jack, king 10. He at least, you know, folds that. So, okay. So you see, when we don't block villain's calling range at all, but we now unblock more folds. That's good. Like the mandatory folds, right? Like 10 high, jack high, king high. And then do we block our own value range? No, we don't, right? I mean, because there's no value bets with a 5 and a deuce to none, right? So, and in the end, I mean, maybe even block some of villain's folding range in the sense that maybe he has 5s and deuces himself and then, you know, made a light call on the flop and then folds river. Right. So in the end, you see that's not a particularly good hand to do it with. And so as you see right here, there's very few hands that have all 3 components. So let's say a really good bluffing hand. Let's say, let's go back. And we'll end the session on that one. Wait, where is that? The 9-8. We'll cut this part out. Yeah, okay. This is the hand I'm trying to talk about. This is going to be the last hand. So if when it comes to like blocking good hands, let's say, I mean, the straights on board here are jack 10 and 6-7, right? So if let's say you have like, if this is a single raise pot and you have, let's say like 10-7 in your hand, right? You block the 6-7 straight and you block the jack 10 straight, right? So basically, so that hand would be great for, let's say, number 3, which we haven't talked about as much, which is blocking your own value hands. If you block your own value hands, now it's less likely for a villain to be blocking your value hands, right? So if let's say on this run out on 9-8-5 queen, if you have 10-7, yeah, you block both of the straights, which means it's more likely that villain just called a turn with a hand like, you know, king queen, which is a good hand in terms of hand strength, but doesn't have any blockers, right? So that's where number 3 comes in. So yeah, you block you block your own value range. That would be number 3. So say, as I was saying in the end, okay, it's bugging a little bit, so I guess it's time to wrap it up, guys. But as I was saying in the end, that is number 3, right? One of the components that David asked about, as in it was about unblocking your own value, or like blocking your own value bets. If you block your own value bets, your opponent is less likely to block them. For instance, if you have the nut flush blocker, your opponent cannot have the nut flush, which obviously means that it's more likely he just has like 1 pair, 2 pair, set, whatnot, and it's less likely for him to call, right? That's what the point I was trying to make. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed it. We've been going for about 2 hours now, so it's time to wrap it up. But if you have a last question or something, I'm going to stop the screen now, the screen share. If you have a final question, feel free to ask right now, anything you like. Obviously, let's try and make it, let's try and keep it somewhat topic related. Next month's topic is going to be about, wait, let me actually share the screen again. There's going to be a lot of cutting and editing for the guys. I'll apologize to them right away. Hold on. So the Boston Inner Hand. And then the last one was next month's topic, which is preparation for having an A-game session. And maybe you think like, that sounds okay. I can learn something, but that's not great. I think it's extremely important. I think it's way more important than some other topics we've talked about. Obviously, we only talk about important topics. But, you know, and the reason I think it's important is especially for myself, you know, I think my biggest leak in poker is not poker, is that I'm not very good at playing my A-game session. So I've done a lot of thinking about how to actually improve myself. So as I said, there's a lot of students I've seen that are quite good at the game of poker, and they're also quite successful, but they could just be way more successful if they fix their mental game, if they fix their preparation and approach to the game. So yeah, it's not good. We're still going to talk about hands, about studying, and we're going to break down some hands. We're going to look at a little bit more of a practical approach on how to maximize your potential. So not talking about only blockers and exploding fish, whatnot, but how to maximize your EV. So considering what to do before playing, how to study, how to select your games, your time selection, everything. Talking about rake back even and rake, selecting tables, finding the weakest opposition, how to study better, just all of those things. They are extremely important. When I play my worst or approach poker, you know, the best way I can versus the worst, my V is just leaps and bounds ahead of when I'm lazy or when I'm just gambling. It's a huge difference. So again, don't pass up on this one. I think it's very, very important. So yeah, basically becoming a better professional in the game of poker. As I said, for me, it's very difficult. So that's one of my weaknesses. Some guys are also really good at that, right? So, but I think a lot of you guys can learn quite a bit from that. So that's the next month's topic. Guys, I really hope you enjoyed the session. It's time for me to wrap it up and, take a break with my voice now. I can't really talk anymore. And I'll see you guys next month, right? Some of the students will speak earlier. If not, obviously, you're welcome to join the stream, of course. So thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next month. All right. Good luck.